Hey, hello, and welcome to today's PSU's Transportation Seminar. My name is Lemeng Wang, and I will be introducing and moderating today's seminar. And our Friday Transportation Seminar has been a tradition since the year 2000. And these seminars are usually held live on Portland State University's urban campus, located on the ancestral homeland of the Monoma, Clackamas, Tumwater, and Walala bands of the Chinook, Tualatin, Kalapuya, and many other indigenous nations of the Columbia River. It's important to acknowledge that we are here because of the sacrifices forced on the indigenous ancestors of this place. Remember these communities and honor their legacies, lives, and descendants. Today, we are very pleased to have Amy Schlusser to present addressing transportation emissions through state climate and energy policy. Amy is the climate policy team lead for the Oregon Department of Energy. She previously served as the agency's senior clean energy policy analyst. Prior to joining the agency in October 2022, Amy worked as a staff attorney with the Green Energy Institute at Lewis and Clark Law School. She has more than a decade of experience working with policy, legal, regulatory frameworks relating to renewable energy, climate change, and transportation. Her work has largely focused on identifying effective and equitable policy pathways to quickly reduce greenhouse gas emission and accelerate a just and equitable transition to a clean and renewable energy system. Here's a preview of next week's seminar and an overview of today's seminar. You'll expect our speaker to present for about 45 minutes, followed by a Q&A, and we will be receiving questions through the Q&A features on your Zoom control panel, and we'll ask them at the end of the presentation. If we run out of time for all your questions, we will give our speakers the opportunity to email written responses or any question left unanswered. We have enabled closed captions, but you must click on the CC feature to view them. We'll be recording today's seminar. It will become available on our website later today, along with presentation slides. If you're tracking professional development hours, this webinar is eligible for 1 hour of continuing education credit. For those of you in the room, we'll pass along the sign-in sheet so that you can get credit for attending today. With that, I will hand over to Amy.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. Thanks for being here today. I'm Amy Schlusser. I'm the climate team lead for the Oregon Department of Energy, and I'm going to talk to you about some strategies for addressing transportation emissions through state climate and energy policies. So before I start, I want to provide a little bit of an introduction to the Oregon Department of Energy. If you're not familiar with our agency, we have our mission statement and important statements up on the slide. The Oregon Department of Energy helps Oregonians make informed energy decisions and advances solutions to shape an equitable clean energy transition, protect the environment and public health, and responsibly balance energy needs and impacts for current and future generations. The Oregon Department of Energy, also known as ODO, O-D-O-E, don't pronounce that, it's ODO. The agency produces a variety of reports and analyses to inform the legislature and the public about energy and climate related actions, trends, and progress. Odo's biennial energy report, which is here on the left, provides a comprehensive review of energy resources, policies, trends, and forecasts, and what they mean for Oregon. And we recently released our 2024 biennial energy report earlier this month. It's available on Odo's website. Odo's biennial zero emissions vehicle report, just in the middle there, was last published in 2023. And it evaluates electric vehicle adoption rates in Oregon and related progress on reducing greenhouse gas emissions from the transportation sector. And then finally, Odo staffs the Oregon Climate Action Commission and produces various reports and analyses on behalf of the commission. So I have two of the reports are visible on this slide. One is the Oregon Climate Action Roadmap to 2030, which presents a variety of strategies to achieve our 2035 greenhouse gas reduction goals by 2030, so in an elevated timeframe. And the Oregon Climate Action Commission's biennial reports to the legislature. The Oregon Climate Action Commission was previously called the Oregon Global Warming Commission, which is why several of our older reports are issued by the Global Warming Commission, but it's now called the Climate Action Commission. So I am going to talk about how Oregon's climate and energy policies are helping to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from the transportation sector. So to provide some context and level setting, this chart depicts Oregon's greenhouse gas emissions over time. Transportation sector emissions are shown at the bottom in dark blue. It appears black on the screen. And they are the largest source of emissions in the state. The transportation sector contributes about 35% of the state's total carbon emissions. Most of these emissions come from the combustion of gasoline and diesel fuels by internal combustion engines. In Oregon and nationally, total transportation fuel consumption has been increasing since 1960. With the only exceptions being the first 2 years of the COVID-19 pandemic, when people were staying home and we actually saw a reduction in transportation fuel consumption. Gasoline and diesel consumption has steadily increased over time and still dominates transportation fuel use. Electricity consumption for transportation is growing rapidly, but it still represents a very small percentage of our overall fuel use. You can't really tell from this graph, but it's the mustard colored line near the bottom. No, not green line near the bottom represents electricity use for transportation. And finally, I'll just note that Oregon imports nearly all of its transportation fuels that are consumed in the state, with only 1.6% of transportation fuels used from in-state production. Electricity would be an exception to that statistic. The Oregon Climate Action Commission's Transformative Integrated Greenhouse Gas Emissions Reduction Analysis, also known as TIGR, evaluated the potential for Oregon to achieve its interim greenhouse gas reduction goal, which was to reduce emissions by at least 45% below 1990 levels by 2035. The analysis found that the state would be able to achieve this interim goal, but only if all of the state's existing policies and programs are implemented as planned. Because some sectors are more difficult to decarbonize than others, some sectors will need to reduce emissions beyond their proportional share for the state to achieve its goals. And the transportation sector is one of these sectors. It has the potential to go above and beyond 45% emissions reductions by 2035 if we transition to cleaner fuels and vehicles and pursue other strategies like reducing vehicle miles traveled and just driving less. Before I jump into the policy discussion, I want to describe some jurisdictional dynamics that influence the types of policy mechanisms that states can use to reduce transportation sector emissions. So the federal government has exclusive jurisdiction over certain types of regulations, meaning only the federal government can adopt these types of standards. So one area in which the feds have exclusive jurisdiction is over fuel economy standards. The federal government adopts CAFE standards, federal combined average fleet fuel economy standards. Don't quote me on that. And states aren't allowed to really override those standards. The federal government also has exclusive jurisdiction to adopt vehicle emission standards for new motor vehicles. There is an exception in the Clean Air Act for California. California is the only state that is allowed to adopt its own vehicle emission standards that are more stringent than the federal standards, and they're only allowed to adopt those standards if certain criteria are met. And they must request and receive a waiver from EPA to adopt those standards. Once California adopts vehicle emission standards and they receive a waiver from EPA, other states like Oregon are allowed to adopt standards that are identical to California's, but they have to be identical. The federal government also has jurisdiction over new vehicle design specifications, and then of course, federal tax credits and incentives. In contrast, states have there are a number of other regulatory mechanisms that states can pursue and that they have jurisdiction over, including low carbon fuel standards, which Oregon has adopted. States can regulate greenhouse gas emissions from vehicles on an aggregate basis. States can adopt their own tax credits and incentives. States have authority to adopt fleet performance standards. So these are standards that would regulate emissions from an entire fleet of vehicles operating in the state, so long as those vehicles are existing vehicles, they're not new vehicles. States like Oregon are also allowed to adopt California emission standards, and states can adopt rules known as indirect source rules that regulate emissions from a specific location and all vehicles and equipment that are operating within and traveling to and from that location. So Oregon has pursued several strategies to reduce transportation emissions through various energy and climate policies. I'm going to talk about some of these broader strategies and policies in my presentation in more detail. So the first strategy that Oregon has pursued is to cap and reduce emissions from transportation fuels. And to do that, Oregon is in the process of adopting climate protection program rules for the state. I'll talk more about those in a minute. Oregon has also pursued a strategy to transition to lower carbon fuels through the Oregon Clean Fuels Program. Oregon is also working to transition to zero emissions vehicles through new vehicle sales mandates, such as the Advanced Clean Cars 2 rule and the Advanced Clean Trucks rule. And finally, Oregon is working to decarbonize its electricity mix through clean energy standards that were established through House Bill 2021 and 2020. I'm going to talk about each of these policies in more detail. I want to start with the Climate Protection Program. And before I provide more context on the Climate Protection Program, I just want to note that these rules are currently proposed. They will be up for a vote next Thursday by the Environmental Quality Commission. I personally sit on the Environmental Quality Commission, but nothing that I'm going to say today I'm not going to say anything that reflects the views of the commission. I'm not going to say anything about my personal opinion about these rules. I just want to make sure that everybody is aware of that. And I cannot take comments on the rules at this time. So if any of you have opinions about the rules, keep them to yourself, please, until after next Thursday. So the Climate Protection Program is a proposed regulatory program that's been being established by the Department of Environmental Quality, or DEQ, to cap and reduce emissions from gasoline, diesel, and other fossil fuels that are used in Oregon. The program also regulates the direct use of natural gas, but it does not cover emissions from natural gas that's used to generate electricity. Those emissions are regulated under HB 2021's clean energy standards. Under the proposed rules, DEQ would freely allocate compliance instruments to regulated entities, such as transportation fuel suppliers. And then those entities could choose to trade, bank, or use their compliance instruments to meet their compliance obligations. So essentially, the state as a whole has an emissions cap, and then DEQ figures out which entities meet a certain threshold within that cap, and it allocates a certain number of compliance instruments to those entities based on their historic emissions and other factors. And then those compliance instruments are fully tradable instruments. As the total program cap declines, the total number of compliance instruments declines as well. So that is the mechanism that will reduce emissions. Regulated entities also have the option to purchase what are being called community climate investment credits. And these are credits that would be used to support projects that reduce greenhouse gas emissions and benefit disadvantaged communities in Oregon, but don't necessarily reduce emissions by the same entity or within the same sector of the regulated entity that has purchased the compliance instrument. Sorry about that. Didn't actually try this yet. So the program status is important. The original climate protection program was established in 2021. Rules were adopted in November of 2021, and the program was in effect for about 2 years. In 2023, the Oregon Court of Appeals invalidated the program on procedural grounds. It did not rule on the substance of the rules themselves or the legality of the substance of the rules or DEQ's authority to adopt the rules. So the Environmental Quality Commission, so DEQ went back, started over, readopted the rules, went through another year-long rulemaking process to establish the new rules. They will now come before the Environmental Quality Commission next Thursday. And if the rules are adopted next Thursday, they will go into effect in 2025. So the proposed climate protection program rules require a 50% reduction in baseline emissions by 2035 and a 90% reduction in emissions by 2050. And baseline emissions are calculated as an average of 2017 to 2019 emissions. Overall, the program proposes to cover a little under half of Oregon's greenhouse gas emissions. And this slide is a little outdated because this is for the original climate protection program rulemaking. So the line that is significant is the green line, which shows the 90% reduction by 2050. To comply with the climate protection program emissions cap, transportation fuel providers will need to limit the aggregate emissions from fuels sold in Oregon. And the program itself doesn't require them to follow any specific strategies to do this. It's up to them how they want to reduce their emissions. So they could, for example, reduce emissions by transitioning to low carbon fuels or transitioning to electricity as a transportation fuel. They can also purchase community climate investment certificates, and they can purchase extra compliance instruments from other regulated entities. Next, I'm going to talk about the Clean Fuels Program. So the Oregon Clean Fuels Program establishes a low carbon fuel standard for the state. This standard requires a 20% reduction in the carbon intensity of transportation fuels by 2030 and a 37% reduction in carbon intensity by 2035. And these carbon intensity reductions are based on a 2015 baseline. This is in contrast to the Climate Protection Program, which is known as a mass-based standard, meaning it sets a cap on the total quantity of emissions. The Clean Fuels Program is an intensity-based standard, which means that it sets a standard based on the amount of carbon emitted per unit of fuel consumed. The Clean Fuels Program reduces the carbon intensity of transportation fuels through a market-based system that's based on an exchange of credits. Carbon intensity refers to the amount of carbon emitted through the entire life cycle of a fuel. So it's not just the fuel itself, it's all of the energy that went in and emissions that are associated with the production of that fuel. Fossil fuels have a higher carbon intensity. So sales of gasoline and diesel create what are known as deficits under the program. Lower carbon fuels, such as renewable diesel and ethanol and electricity, earn credits, and these credits can be used to offset deficits under the program. So if you are a fossil fuel, like a gasoline or diesel provider, you're required to report under this program, you earn deficits for every unit of fuel you sell, and you have to then procure enough credits to equal or exceed your deficits during a compliance period. This slide just shows the standard for gasoline and diesel, which are slightly different, and how it has declined over time from the program's inception in 2016, start of the program in 2016, through 2035. Electricity that's used as a transportation fuel generates credits, and utilities and EV charger owners and transit agencies can sell these credits into the Clean Fuels Program market and earn money for those credits. For individuals that charge their EVs at home, the utility typically collects the credits associated with their EV charging, but it doesn't always make sense for a utility to collect those credits on behalf of their customers, particularly if it's a really small utility or a rural utility. So instead, the Clean Fuels Program has what's known as a backstop aggregator that collects all of the eligible electricity credits, and sells them and reinvests them back into Oregon, or just make sure that they're collected, sold, and reinvested back into Oregon. DEQ selected the Fourth Mobility Fund to be the backstop aggregator for the state. And so the Fourth Mobility Fund collects any unclaimed credits, and it designs programs that promote and support transportation electrification across the state. Since 2018, DEQ has invested more than $2 million in state programs to expand customer outreach, engage utilities, and implement pilot projects across the state. To date, the Clean Fuels Program has succeeded in incentivizing sales of low carbon fuels in Oregon. DEQ publishes a summary of the data that's submitted by registered parties through their quarterly reports. And the summaries provide information on the volumes and the kinds of fuels that are being used to comply with the program, and the number of credits and deficits generated by those fuels. So this table is from DEQ's Clean Fuels Summary Report for the second quarter of 2024. And it shows the quantities and types of low carbon fuels that were sold in Oregon from 2016 through June of this year. And as you can see from this chart, sales of ethanol and biodiesel, which are shown in purple and orange at the bottom, have been relatively constant throughout the program's existence. And electricity, which is shown in dark blue, has increased somewhat gradually starting around 2020. But most notably, I think from this chart is the bright blue line, which is renewable diesel. And you can see that starting around the end of 2022 or mid 2022, sales of renewable diesel in Oregon have increased dramatically. And there isn't, the agency is still really trying to figure out why this is happening. The Clean Fuels program has certainly had an impact, but there is also a potential influence from the climate protection program, which was in effect during that period. So this table shows the credits and deficits that are earned under the Clean Fuels program, as well as the number of credits that have been banked by regulated entities. So the fuel suppliers that the program regulates and the credit generators, which are companies that produce and sell low carbon fuels, have so far exceeded the program's targets each year since the program began in 2016. As you can see more recently in 2023 and 2024, the number of credits that were issued under the program pretty significantly increased the number of deficits that were issued under the program, and the number of credits that have been banked for future use has now skyrocketed in the past few years. So the Clean Fuels program's 20% and 37% carbon intensity reduction targets were adopted in 2022, and they seem to be very achievable, particularly as supplies of low carbon fuels like renewable diesel have increased, and as we transitioned more and more vehicles to electric vehicles. And as the sale of clean fuels have increased, the number of credits available for purchase has increased. This chart shows the monthly credit transfer data for the program, including the average price that's paid for credits on the marketplace in the clean fuels market. And this, you can see as the number of credits and surplus credits has increased, the average price to purchase a credit has decreased considerably. This is a bit of a problem under a market-based program like this because it reduces the financial incentive to sell low carbon fuels if you're not getting as much value from a sale of each unit of fuel. And it also reduces the credit revenues that can be reinvested in the state. On that somewhat dour note, I'm going to change topics. Talk about zero electric vehicle adoption. So Oregon has adopted goals to increase EV registrations and sales in the state from 2020 through 2035. In early 2021, the state achieved its 2020 goal of having 50,000 registered electric vehicles in the state. The lag in achieving that goal was largely due to slowdowns in overall vehicle sales during the first 2 years of the COVID-19 pandemic. ODO tracks EV registrations using the Oregon Department of Transportation's data and reports these registrations on our website on our EV dashboard, which if any of you care about and want to track the number of electric vehicles registered in the state, I encourage you to check out our EV dashboard. There's a lot of information available there, and it's very easy to use and to find information. As of July 2024, there were just over 100,000 zero emissions vehicles registered in Oregon. And the chart on this slide shows the ratio of EVs that are, or the number of ZEVs registered in the state and the ratio of those vehicles that are battery electric vehicles and plug-in hybrid electric vehicles. This chart only goes through 2022. Based on our current registration level of 100,000 plus, because that's from July, but a little bit more than 100,000 registered EVs in the state, it doesn't look likely that the state will achieve its 2025 goal of having 250,000 registered EVs in the state. But despite this lag, the state is still poised to meet its future EV sales targets, which aim for at least 50% of new vehicles sold to be EVs by 2030, and at least 90% of new vehicles to be EVs or zero emissions vehicles by 2035. Much of this forecast for EV adoption is based on the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality's implementation of the Advanced Clean Cars 2 rule, which was approved by the Environmental Quality Commission in December of 2022. Under this rule, vehicle manufacturers must meet an increasing target of EV deliveries for sale in the state, starting with 25% of new vehicles sold in 2026 and culminating in 100% of new vehicle sales for light duty vehicles in 2035. And taking a step back to the jurisdictional dynamics I talked about a few slides ago, states do not have authority to adopt emission standards for new vehicles, except for the state of California. And so this is one of those exceptions. The Advanced Clean Cars 2 rule was adopted by California. It's more stringent than the federal standards. It received a waiver from EPA. Once it received that waiver, other states, including Oregon, were eligible to adopt the rule and enforce it at the state level. So that's why we have Advanced Clean Cars 2. The Advanced Clean Cars 2 sales targets only apply to sales of new vehicles. They don't apply to sales of used vehicles. And if Oregon achieves its Advanced Clean Cars 2 sales targets, it will meet or exceed its 2030 and 2035 EV adoption goals. Medium and heavy duty zero emission vehicle adoption lags behind light duty EV adoption. This is largely due to the complexity of medium and heavy duty vehicle makes and models, the higher costs for these vehicles, and the cost and availability of medium and heavy duty charging. As you can see from the line chart on the left of this slide, the number of medium and heavy duty CEVs registered in Oregon were still quite low as of January 2023. These charts are from ODO's biennial zero emissions vehicle report, which was put out in 2023. So they're a little bit outdated, but not much. So far, the largest amount of adoption has been for delivery vans and transit buses, as you can see from the pie chart on the right. Electric school bus adoption is becoming more prevalent, largely due to utility programs that offset the cost for budget for buses and help fleet managers minimize the charging infrastructure costs. ODO also administers a public purpose charge schools program, which helps school districts across the state fund and support school bus electrification. And EPA offers competitive grants for electric school buses as well. School districts that operate electric school buses are also eligible for credits under the Clean Fuels program. I also want to note that the data on the number of medium and heavy duty vehicle registrations is produced using a variety of data from a variety of sources. And there are some data gaps that we're dealing with. So it's possible that the actual number of medium and heavy duty vehicle registrations is higher than the estimate shown here. So similarly to the Advanced Clean Cars 2 rule, Oregon has also adopted sales targets for medium and heavy duty zero emissions vehicles. In 2021, the Environmental Quality Commission adopted the Advanced Clean Trucks rule, which requires vehicle manufacturers to sell a certain number of zero emissions medium and heavy duty trucks as a percentage of new vehicle sales. The percentage of vehicles that must be ZEVs varies by vehicle class, and it phases in over time. This is slightly different from the Advanced Clean Cars rule, which applies the same target to all vehicle classes, all light duty vehicle classes. By 2035, 40% of Class 7 and 8 trucks, these are the largest tractor trailers, must be zero emissions vehicles. Sales of new class 7 and 8 trucks must be ZEVs. 55% of class 4 through 8 trucks, these are buses and large delivery vehicles, must be ZEVs, and 75% of medium duty pickup trucks and delivery vans must be ZEVs. The chart here shows this phase in over time for the different vehicle classes. And like the Advanced Clean Cars 2 rule, the Advanced Clean Trucks rule is a requirement on vehicle manufacturers. It doesn't require fleets or businesses to purchase zero emissions vehicles. DEQ is implementing a program to assist fleets in making the transition to zero emission medium and heavy duty vehicles through grants and incentive programs, and to help fleets install charging infrastructure. In addition to those sort of key policies that I just talked about, there are many other state policies and programs across multiple agencies that support increased EV adoption. This includes, for example, DEQ's Clean Vehicle and Charge Ahead rebates, and the work of the Oregon Public Utilities Commission with Oregon's investor-owned utilities to develop and implement transportation electrification plans. There are also several programs that are being administered by the Oregon Department of Transportation to reduce vehicle miles traveled across the state. There's a whole laundry list of programs here. I'm not going to go into all of these in detail, but they're here on this slide, and I'm happy to share the slide with anyone that would like to reference this later. So to reduce transportation sector emissions, Oregon's energy policies largely focus on gradually restricting sales of new gasoline and diesel fueled vehicles in the state, and then reducing the carbon intensity of liquid fuels that are used by legacy non-zero emission vehicles. Over the long term, these strategies will gradually transition the fleet's registered passenger vehicle fleet to cars that run on electricity rather than fossil fuels. Because this transition is intended to address the state's contributions to climate change, it's important to understand the climate impacts from EVs themselves. The Oregon Department of Energy frequently receives questions about whether building an electric vehicle has more emissions than building an internal combustion engine vehicle. So the bar chart here, which was developed by EPA, shows that there are more greenhouse gas emissions associated with building an EV than an internal combustion engine vehicle. But over the lifetime of the vehicle, the emissions reductions from driving an EV are far greater than from driving an internal combustion engine vehicle. This table relies on data that applies national averages for the carbon intensity of electricity. And so the average carbon intensity of Oregon's electricity mix is much lower than the average carbon intensity of the national electricity mix. So if driving an EV in Oregon has even fewer life cycle emissions than the chart here depicts. And the carbon intensity of Oregon's electricity mix will continue to drop over the next few decades as the state's largest investor-owned utilities, PGE and Pacific Power, comply with the clean electricity targets or clean energy standards established by HB 2021. HB 2021 was a landmark piece of climate legislation that requires PGE and Pacific Power to provide their Oregon customers with 80% clean electricity by 2030, 90% clean electricity by 2035, and 100% clean electricity by 2040. The HB 2021's clean energy standards require utilities to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions associated with the electricity that's sold to Oregon customers. So it's a clean energy standard, but it actually functions as an emissions standard. So to comply with the standard, the utilities have to demonstrate that the electricity that they've sold to customers and the associated emissions are 80, 90, and 100% below their baseline emissions, which is an average of 2010 to 2012 emissions. The utilities are required to report their emissions to DEQ each year, and those reports are used to then determine compliance with HB 2021. So ultimately, HB 2021 will really force the utilities to transition the types of resources that they use to generate electricity that they sell in the state. We don't really know what those resources will look like because the statute itself doesn't require them to use any specific resources. It just requires them to reduce the emissions associated with their electricity mix. So they can use non-emitting electricity sources such as traditional hydropower and nuclear power, neither of which are currently eligible for Oregon's renewable portfolio standard, which is another law that the state has to promote renewable energy use in the state. But those resources would qualify for compliance with HB 2021. And they can also use other emissions reduction strategies like increasing energy efficiency, reducing the overall amount of electricity that we use in the state. That also would reduce emissions. The Oregon Department of Transportation forecasted the carbon intensity of the state's electricity mix through 2050 as and their forecast is shown on this slide here. With the policies that have been adopted in the last 4 years, including HB 2021's 100% clean energy standard, ODOT projects that the carbon intensity of electricity in Oregon will decrease significantly, which will also cause the carbon intensity of the transportation sector to drop. But while the carbon intensity of Oregon's electricity mix is projected to drop, electricity consumption is expected to rise on the whole. Transportation electrification will contribute to the increase in electricity demand, but it isn't expected to be the largest driver of increased demand in the state. Right now, it really looks like data centers are going to be driving pretty large increases in electricity demand, and artificial intelligence is like blowing our estimates out of the water. We're really not sure how to estimate the electricity demand associated with artificial intelligence because Oregon is we have a lot of data centers here. Fortunately, transportation electrification isn't expected to have any major reliability impacts on the regional electric grid in the near future. And I say in the near future because when we're projecting out reliability impacts, we typically do so in a relatively short time frame. Oregon electric utilities and the broader Western grid aren't expecting to experience any resource adequacy issues associated with the adoption of EVs over the next 5 years, and likely over the next decade. And when we talk about resource adequacy, what that really means is, do we have enough electricity generating resources available on the system to meet our energy needs at any given time? If you don't have enough resources to meet demand at any given time, you can cause serious issues with the grid and reliability problems. The Pacific Northwest National Labs conducted a study to assess resource adequacy using 3 different EV adoption scenarios. And they found that even under a high penetration EV adoption scenario, in which there were more than 9.3 million EVs operating on the Western grid in 2028, there were no resource adequacy issues expected under normal operating conditions. This study also found that if utilities implement load management strategies to shift EV load during peak demand times, that the number of EVs operating on the Western grid could be more than doubled to 19.6 million EVs without triggering resource adequacy concerns. And that's by 2028, which is significant because it takes a certain amount of time to build new resources. So if we have a long lead time, we can build the resources we need to meet demand. What's more concerning is massive spikes in demand over a short period of time where we don't have enough time to build resources to meet that demand. Many electric utilities have developed and are testing load management strategies, like time of use electricity rates, to accommodate growing EV charging load. And the chart that you see here is from Portland General Electric's Integrated Resource and Transportation Electrification Plans. And it shows that the anticipated load growth or increase in electricity demand under their reference case scenario is that the anticipated load growth from EV loads is less than their expected energy savings from energy efficiency measures. So this is really just meant to show that we can accommodate fairly large increases in electricity demand resulting from transportation electrification without having to build new resources, at least in the relatively near term. We've also found that while electric vehicles will cause household energy consumption to increase, it won't cause an unprecedented degree of household energy increase in household energy demand. This chart estimates the annual electricity consumption for various residential technologies. And as you can see from the highlighted line, a level 2 EV charger consumes slightly more electricity on an annual basis than an electric water heater, but it uses less than half of the electricity of an electric baseboard heating system. So installing charging and charging your vehicles at home is not going to cause your house to suddenly use an insane amount of additional electricity. So if the policies that I've talked about today are implemented as planned, they will put Oregon on track to achieve significant reductions in greenhouse gas emissions from the transportation sector. This chart here is from the Oregon Department of Transportation's 2022 forecast of life cycle transportation greenhouse gas emissions through 2050. The dark blue line on this chart shows the forecasted life cycle greenhouse gas emissions from Oregon's transportation system. The pink line shows emissions reductions that could be achieved through the statewide transportation strategy. Just to explain why there's a little bit of a difference with the dotted line here, ODOT updated their forecast model in 2022, and they found that newly adopted policies would drive additional greenhouse gas reductions, which is why the blue line, which is the 2022 projection, differs so dramatically from the dashed line, which is the 2018 forecast projections. I also want to note that this forecast is for life cycle greenhouse gas emissions, which includes upstream emissions that aren't accounted for in our state's emissions reduction goals. So if we achieve this level of emissions reduction, we'll actually go beyond just what we are responsible for in state and what we track with our sector-based emissions reductions. So these emissions reductions would make a very considerable contribution towards achieving our greenhouse gas reduction goals, but they will only occur if our policies are implemented as planned. And a big variable here is maintaining political will. If we don't maintain political will, it could be challenging to achieve these levels of emissions reductions. And if we don't achieve these reductions, it will be incredibly difficult for the state to meet its 2050 climate greenhouse gas reduction goal. And that's all I have. I'm happy to answer questions.
Hey, Thank you, Amy. For those of you this seminar view the webinar, please feel free to submit your questions. Use the Q&A feature in the control panel at the bottom of the Zoom window. For those of you in the room, you can of course raise your hand if you have any question. Okay, start with.
I need to ask a clarification, and could you, and not a comment on the rulemaking, could you go back to a slide in the very beginning where you just list the 4 or 5 policies that you went through? I'll be honest, I'm getting the titles of them all mixed up.
I'm sorry, and that's very understandable.
Oh, no,
They
because
have-
they use the same similar words and everything. Okay, the cap and reduce, the climate protection program policy, which is like a cap rate for transportation fuels. I guess what I don't understand is the difference or the overlap between that and the low carbon fuels program, because that seems like a cap and trade system within for a single like fuel provider, right?
it is and it isn't. So, and I, believe me, you are not alone. in
Okay.
Not understanding like how these programs differ and how they work together. Really, the distinction is that the climate protection program is a mass-based standard. So it sets a cap on the total amount of greenhouse gas emissions that can be emitted at the state level, regardless of how much fuel is consumed. That cap will continue to decline. The Clean Fuels Program is an intensity-based standard. So the level of emissions associated with each gallon of fuel sold has to reduce over time, but you could still increase the total amount of emissions from transportation fuels if you saw a major increase in fuel consumption. There's no cap on the total amount of emissions. They are both market-based programs that use credits that are tradable.
Yeah.
So there are a lot of similarities between the programs, and ultimately they're very compatible with one another. They don't conflict with one another.
Yeah.
Compliance, the same entities that have to comply with the Clean Fuels Program also have to comply with the Climate Protection Program. And so the investments that they make into lower carbon fuels will help them comply with both programs.
Okay, so for example, I mean, what is an example of a company that complies with like the Clean Fuels Program that would also?
Like Shell.
Okay,
oil,
that's what
yeah,
I'm assuming.
BP,
So Shell for everything that they sell in the state.
yes.
Okay, all right, that helps me understand, thanks.
And just a clarification from on the last slide, the graph that shows the decrease over time.
Oh, the ODOT graph?
The ODOT graph, the last one. And you just brought up, I think linking this is that this one is not just from those 4 strategies that's gonna get us down there. There is components of reduction of EMT and pricing that will also that drive that line down. So it's not just vehicles and fuels, but there's other aspects that make up that decrease. I just wanted to.
Yes, thank you for clarifying. Yes, this represents all of our state actions that we're doing to reduce emissions from the transportation sector. As of 2022, I mean, reduce the forecast.
Hey, I will ask a few online questions. So the first one is, I'm not sure, this is still very fresh, so I'm not sure whether you have thought or as Odo has thought of the new administration was coming. I believe I heard news that the EV credit will likely goes away. So how would that impact the AV adoption? And let's see, California's, I'm not sure you can retroactively revoke that because the online question asked about California's permit for more stringent vehicle fleet policy may also come under scrutiny. So your thoughts on?
Yes, so there is a lot of uncertainty right now regarding the future of federal policies for decarbonization across the board. If the federal tax credits were to go away for electric vehicles, it would be real detriment for consumers, which would then have to pay more for electric vehicles. It would not impact Oregon's mandate that a percentage of new vehicles be EVs by certain dates. It would just mean that potentially consumers would have to pay more for those vehicles than they would if they qualified for the federal tax credit. I cannot speak to the likelihood of whether those will go away. There's a lot of uncertainty here. Regarding the California waiver, there is also a bit of uncertainty there, but for different reasons. So in order to receive a waiver under the Clean Air Act, California has to show that certain criteria are met. They're in statute, those criteria. EPA has determined on multiple occasions that California has met those criteria. And if California meets those criteria, EPA has to grant them a waiver. It's not a discretionary action. They're required to by statute. So revoking a waiver that has already been granted would be pretty unprecedented. And they would essentially, EPA would have to go back and show that no, California actually hadn't met these criteria. So from a legal standpoint, that seems like it would be pretty difficult to do. But there is uncertainty, you know, we can't predict how a court would rule if in the event that happened.
I have a question about the clean fuels program credits that you talked about, that it would been unclaimed and then gone with the program and sold and put towards, I guess, programs that would benefit clean fuels further. Has there been any assessment on kind of the impact of, what would be the impact of letting those credits just disappear rather than reclaiming them and putting them towards this program? So kind of the cost benefit of those two different approaches.
That is a really good question. I do not know the answer to that question, but I am happy to look into that and reach out to the Clean Fuels program. It's a good question because the backstop aggregator wasn't always part of the program. It was something that was added to the program in 2022. So I would presume that there has been analysis around that, and if there hasn't been, there's certainly data that we can compare.
Question I have related to that is, how do those programs, the Fourth Mobility Fund, know when I'm charging the EV at home? Do they have kind of a way to, because in my case, I do have a Tesla at home. I just use the whatever outlet that I already have in the house. I didn't actually apply for a permit to do a EV charging station or something.
Yes, so I cannot recall. There is a way that they do it, and I cannot recall off the top of my head if it's just based on the utility going and looking at usage patterns during certain time of the day, or if it is like a self-reporting.
I see.
Alright, it's another thing I
Yeah,
can look into
no,
though. There is a process.
Yeah, there is a lot of detail in there. I think you'll probably have time for last question. I believe you already mentioned, probably already touched upon the question there, that online question asking about some planning or some work that ODOT is doing that is a bit counter to the goal of reducing greenhouse gas emission, including freeway widening project like the Rose Quarter, and also the interstate bridge replacement project. I suppose, can you speak to whether that's part of the consideration already included in the assessment, or it's kind of something that's different?
Yeah, I really can't speak to that question. I work for the Department of Energy and not the Department of Transportation, so I'm not, you know, intimately aware with with what went into their forecasting and how they model VMT reductions over time. Yes, sorry.
Yeah.
Another question for the Department of Transportation.
Yeah, so people from ODOT, yeah, okay. Thank you all for attending today's Friday Transportation Seminar. For those of you who join remotely, after the seminar, and you will have the opportunity to complete a brief survey about today's event. It should only take a few minutes, and certainly appreciate your feedback. And thank you, Amy, and thank you all for joining us today.
And I have my email address up on the screen. If anybody has questions in the future, please reach out to me.
Thank you.